browsers work and how exactly HTML or DOM is going to get created. We also discussed a bit about a library called libwww. We talked about some free or open source engines which are rendering engines available, or we also talked about something called as some DOM standard like W3C and WhatWG as in community standard. And these are some sort of, you can say, terms that we discussed yesterday. And then we try to understand what exactly a DOM is. So in today's session, what we are going to understand certain JavaScript basics, and we will also understand a bit of debugging today. Debugging is going to play a very vital role in every developer's life. So we will try to focus on debugging, and then some points which are kind of maybe in terms of understanding wise, it's miscellaneous. So we'll try to understand that part as well. So hopefully this session is going to give you some ground level basics and help you in terms of your program through debugging. So agenda in this program or in today's session is very simple. We have like all in all 4 points in the agenda. One is we will try to see how do we add a JavaScript into the page. Then what are the locations wherein we can add JavaScript. Then we will try to understand pros and cons of each. Then we will try to understand the execution flow of a JavaScript. So just by adding JavaScript into your application, the code won't actually flow automatically. So it's like when you put a code at some X location versus when you put a code at some Y location into your page, then there are certain dependencies that your code may have. Like there are dependencies on some HTML elements, there are dependencies on some input elements. So based on those dependencies, where exactly you should put the code, what exactly happens when the execution of JavaScript happens, we will see that. Then there is another term which some of you may have heard, which is called as JavaScript hoisting. So this is a very interesting term compared to other routine languages like C, C++, or C#. You will find out JavaScript has certain what we call as complex features or certain completely extraordinary features, and one of the feature that we see is called as hoisting. So it's an interesting feature we will try to understand today, and later on in the later half of the second half of the session, we are going to understand some typical problems that developers face, and then how do we solve those problems with the help of debugging. So let's continue the session now. So agenda is clear to all of you, and then we will try to maybe see one point at a time. So here we go. JavaScript and HTML, that's the first part we need to understand. So certain ground level basics in terms of JavaScript we need to put up here on a screen. So let me tell you one thing friendly. In this session, instead of like discussions, we are going to go and have a lot of demonstrations. So to start with, we are going to go and create one HTML file. We are going to add some piece of JavaScript. We are going to add some HTML content, and then we will have this session demo oriented. So a kind of proof of concept is what we all will have with respect to the JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is we need to understand some basics in terms of JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to desktop, and then just like yesterday we created HTML file, just like that we will open VS Code today, the editor. Then I'm going to create one new file. I'll save this file on desktop as demo. It's a second day, so demo02.html. Let me save this file. Now what we want to do is we want to add some basic HTML. Since JavaScript is going to have association with HTML, that's what the session is for. So we will have to add HTML first, and then we will inject JavaScript into it. So how do we do that? Yesterday we discussed about some basics of HTML. So we will have HTML tag, we will have routine head tag, we will have routine title. This time let's add demo2, and then let's have a body tag added. in like inside body, I'm not going to have anything as such. And just to see whether things are working fine or not, I'm just going to double click on HTML file and open this in browser. So I have double clicked here. What appears, as you can see, we have demo2 at the like title bar, and then you will find out demo2 appearing here. There is no content in the body, so it's all empty. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Now, what we want to do is we need to understand like exactly why JavaScript is required. So yesterday there was a demonstration, if you recall, wherein we tried to take the value of a text box on a button click, and then HTML alone is not going to have kind of, you can say, typical interactivity unless until some APIs are going to get introduced through HTML5. So instead of that, like instead of only HTML, we are going to have an interactivity using JavaScript. So what I'm going to do now, let's try some basics now. So let's take example like this. In this HTML, if at all we need to add some sort of logic, like JavaScript logic, then you can create a separate file, which is the, you can say, we will discuss in some time. But then generally, any language code, scripting language code that you wish to put in HTML, generally we put it in a tag called as script tag. So I have added script and /script. So yesterday we discussed head consists of title, and just like that, head tag can also have script tag added. Okay. Now, is this HTML tag? The tag is HTML, but then what goes inside this tag, that is something which is some sort of scripting language code. Okay. Now, which language code I did not mention here. Generally, just like yesterday, there was a name attribute, there was ID attribute, there was value attribute for input tag. Just like that, script also can have here a language attribute wherein we can add a language that we are going to go and use in the script tag, or the language code that we are going to go and author in the script tag. Typically, we can specify here like JavaScript or VBScript like languages. But then, as you know, VBScript is something which is, we don't use anymore. You will find out, even if I don't put here language, default considered is a JavaScript itself. So what I'm going to do is, without specifying language, I'll start writing JavaScript directly. So again, what we are going to go and plan is a simple code we will try to put here. Simple hi, hello, simple addition, subtraction kind of a code we will put. And then we will try to understand how this code gets executed. So what I'm going to do is, I just want to declare two different variables, and those should hold some value, and then simple addition is what I would like to hold in a third variable. And I would like to put that maybe third variable addition, or third variable which holds the addition, on the console inside the HTML or inside the web browser. So here is how we will do it. I don't have any input element, I don't have any UI added as of now. So what I'll do is, I would like to declare some variable. Now in JavaScript, we don't actually have, just like C, maybe declaration of integer like this, or declaration of short like this. Whatever we define in JavaScript, it's ultimately its simple key value pair. So in here, in order to define some integer or a string or an array even, ultimately we declare a var, a kind of, you can say, maybe a declaration. Var in the sense, you can consider it as a variant as of now. So var, and then a variable name. So I'm declaring a variable. Let's call this variable as a variable, and then I'm going to hold some value into it. Let's hold a value like 100. Generally, semicolon we can put here. Now var a equal to 100, var b is equal to 200. So there are two variables that I have declared just now, declared and defined. So I have declared var a and defined it with 100 value, declared var b and defined 200 as a value. Now what I wish to do is, I wish to do the addition. So I'll put here var addition is equal to a plus b, and then whatever maybe content that we get here, I wish to print it on a screen. So in order to print, rather instead of accessing the screen directly, or the inputs or the elements in HTML directly, which is going to go and come in later part, I'm going to just use console, and I'm going to say log on the console the value of addition. Just like yesterday we saw, this console window. Similar way we are going to use console window today. So this is during debugging or during maybe like running this code on the browser using the development tool, developer can see what is getting printed as addition. So I have just added 3-4 lines of code here, which is not a rocket science. It's a very simple code added. Let us see how exactly code gets executed. So what I'll do is I'm going to open browser again and I'm going to refresh here. Okay, I refresh but nothing appears on a screen because the output is what I printed in console. So what I need to do is I need to press here F12. So if I press F12, you'll find out on the console there is a value printed here, as you can see, which is 300 now. So I have logged down to the console, that is the development window, and then under development window under console I have printed the addition, that is 300 over here. This works perfectly fine. So we can very well take this value 300 maybe later on and we can put it inside the text box, or we can send it to the server side maybe as and when the right time comes. So we have VS Code. I just have put up here so-called addition content on the console. So how exactly code execution happened here? So what you need to understand, yesterday we talked about it, that entire HTML execution is typical sequential, which means when this entire HTML is given to the browser, the rendering engine of the browser, in this case Chrome, tried to take one tag at a time. So it did read HTML, then it did read head, it read something called as title, and then it keeps on constructing those DOM elements. So in yesterday's session we talked about it, the DOM construction happens, so-called you can say tag by tag. So I have HTML, I have head, I have title. You'll find out these tags by tags, you will find out the DOM elements are going to get constructed in memory. So here we have head, body, title kind of you can say contents. Then in memory, if I just right click and view source, this is same sort of representation of the content. And then you will find out in DOM, in memory from yesterday's session, you saw it like there are some objects representation. So there is some HTML element for head, HTML element for title. Now when it comes to script, what is it that happens? Is the rendering engine capable of executing JavaScript? Ultimately, it can be any script over here. It can be JavaScript, it can be VB script. So is your rendering engine capable of executing all kind of scripts? Absolutely no. So normally a rendering engine is going to hand over this script execution part to another engine which is called as JavaScript engine. So ultimately your browser is going to have kind of rendering engine which is based on top of libwww library, and then whenever it finds a script tag into your HTML, what it does, it hands over the execution to so-called scripting engine. Now in this case we are talking about JavaScript engine. So JavaScript engine will come in picture, and then JavaScript engine will try to take these 4 lines of code and will try to execute these 4 lines of code. Okay, when will these lines be executed? Since I have not wrapped up this code inside a function, had it been inside a function, I needed to tell them to the JavaScript engine that this is the time I would like to call the function. If you recall yesterday's case, yesterday there was a code written for collecting data from input tag, and then we just tried to print that data using button click. So there was a way to tell to the JavaScript engine that whenever button gets clicked, I need to execute some function XYZ. Here, if you notice, the entire 4 lines of code is included directly inside a script tag. So if you see, there is no so-called, you can say, maybe a trigger required specifically for calling of this code. The code is open for execution directly. So what is it that happens behind the scene when we put a code like this, or code directly inside a script tag without writing or without wrapping it inside so-called, you can say, functions also? Now there are interesting things that we need to understand. What happens here is, by default, in case of JavaScript, as and when this content is given to a JavaScript engine, what JavaScript engine does is, it actually creates something which is called as one global object. Okay, now what does that mean? Just like yesterday we talked about DOM object. So we talked about it as this tag is presented as HTML element. This tag is also represented as one HTML element, and these are like hierarchically arranged one after another. So ultimately each tag that you see is presented as an object in memory, and that object's hierarchy we call it as DOM. In case of script, specifically in case of JavaScript, what happens is whenever these lines of code is handed over to JavaScript Engine creates one global object in memory. So one more time, I'm going to start Notepad here and we will start understanding here. So some parts like there is JavaScript Engine, and then what JavaScript Engine does now. So if I just take line by line, there was HTML. Maybe what I should do is I should copy this entire code. I should paste it here first, or maybe I should do the formatting within. That way formatting becomes easy. So what I have here is now there is this HTML content added. Rendering engine. So this line when given to rendering engine, this line, rendering engine will try to look at HTML tag, will try to understand it, and will try to create an object in DOM. So when given to rendering engine, I should put line like this. So when this line is given to rendering engine, what rendering engine does is it creates one DOM object, let's say. Okay, all good. And then you will find out something like this is going to get repeated. I should say insert here. So there will be like several objects created one after another like this. Now, this hierarchy once created, and whenever the rendering engine comes to notice something called as there is a script element that we have. So what is it that now what happens is when this is given to rendering engine, it notices it's a script, it's a code which needs execution. So ultimately it's just going to go and hand over this content or bring back in picture somebody called as JavaScript Engine. JavaScript being default language. So what happens is now content is handed over to JavaScript Engine. Okay, now what is it that JavaScript Engine will do? By default, job of this JavaScript Engine will be the JavaScript Engine is going to create one global object in memory. This global object, again, generally in JavaScript, if I say everything is an object, normally in JavaScript, if everything is object, then every object in JavaScript is typically going to hold something which is called as key and a value pair. Okay, let's prove it. So what I said some time back, by default JavaScript Engine when comes in picture, the very first thing it does is it creates one object which is called global object, and this global object is going to have several other objects inside it, which is ultimately going to be some key and value pair. Okay, so it's kind of collection that we are going to go and have here. What sort of collection we are going to go and have, and what exactly this global object is called as? Generally in JavaScript, the global object that you have is generally called by, or at any moment it can be referred using keyword called as this. Okay, can we check this? So let's do one thing. When we have this line, or when this line was given to rendering engine, I said it created object in memory, DOM object. Head, there was a DOM object constructed. So on with title, so on with body and all. But then whenever there was a script, what happens is, now obviously JavaScript engine has something to work with. It has got 4 lines of code for execution before the rendering engine proceeds with your body part here. So in order to come down to the slash head, or so-called you can say body and slash body, rendering engine will have to wait now, because now it's in wait state, so that it can actually see this code getting executed. So you will find out rendering engine is in wait state specifically for execution of rest of the code, or rest of the markup code I should say, till the time JavaScript engine execute these 4 lines of code. So now rendering engine is waiting till the JavaScript engine releases the resources, or it just holds the execution. So JavaScript engine will quickly create a global object which is called as this, and it will actually have so-called key value pairs inside it. Let's try to understand what this object means and what these things even mean. Let me take you to code again. So I'm already on console window. Addition is already printed on the console. Here is what I'm going to do. Before I put up anything on a screen, let me put here this. The time you put this, you will find out it tries to show you something like this is a current window that we have. So what does that mean? It says there is a global object that JavaScript has constructed. That global object is actually object of type window. It's a type of the object. And then ultimately, the global object which is constructed by the JavaScript in memory is window object, and that object is ultimately going to have a parent. If you look at it here, key, and then there is a value, key, and there is a value, key, and there is a value that you will notice. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to expand this further. And now you will see window, and then there is a key and a value. There is B200 and a value. There is addition, and then there is 300 assigned to it. So what you should notice now, that in JavaScript, whatever you created just now, like A, B and addition, you'll find out these are also added as keys and values to the global object. Why global object? Reason is you have put up the code directly for execution. Okay, what if I wrap this code inside a function? Let's see that. So what will happen if I wrap this entire code content inside a function? So if I put here function, let's call it as add, and let's put it here. So there is variable declaration that I have done, and I have put up and wrapped up entire code in an add function. Okay, now what will happen if I have only function written? Keep it in mind, I haven't called add function yet. Okay, let's go back, refresh it. Again one more time. See, now there is no 300 printed because we need to call the function. So I'm going to put here this. There is a window object which is referred, a global context. If I just expand it, now you will find out add is a key and function actual content is going to be so-called you can say its body. So you will find out add is added as a key and the function body is added as a value in here. So this becomes a key and rest of it becomes a body in this case. Oh sorry, a value. So this is key and this is value that we have. So just like sometime back A was a key and 100 was a value. Now I have wrapped it up here. Now add is a key and function is a value. So if you notice this, ultimately this function declaration or definition that I did, or even a variable creation that I did earlier, you'll find out these are attached to some sort of object in JavaScript. So by default there is a global object constructed which is called as window, which is referred by the keyword this, and then that this will always have variables and functions added as key value pairs. What will happen if I do something like this? If I put here var, maybe let's say something like message equal to, maybe I'll say hello. So when I say var message in this case, you'll find out now there will be two different keys. One key is called as message added, and then one key will be add. Value of message key will be hello, and value of add will be the body of the function. If I go back, if I refresh here, again if I write this, current window object is going to go and have add as a function, and it's also going to have somewhere here message as a key and a value as in hello. And then what are other things that we have here? So these are the values that we have, which are like so-called default keys and default values that the global object is going to go and hold. Okay, so generally JavaScript objects are key and value pairs is what we need to understand. Now, after this basic understanding, let's come back to execution phase. Under execution, like whenever you have execution done like this, I said there will be some DOM object constructed by rendering engine. Here also there is so-called, you can say, whenever content is handed over to JavaScript engine, there is already a global object created, and that global object will be attached with A 100, B 200, addition with the actual addition content, and so on. So you will find out this global object is going to go and play a very vital role. However, we haven't seen any local context yet, so we are actually limiting ourselves to global object as of now. So now if you notice, I just have put up this code in a script tag which is directly inside a head. Okay, let's try to understand another thing now. So one more time, I'm going to remove these braces and I'm going to add the code as it was before. So this was the code before: simple variable declarations, addition, and console.log. So this script was added inside a head tag. What will happen if I move this script inside or after the body? So, or inside the body, let's say, or in general, maybe after the body also, or inside the body, whichever way is fine. So what will happen if I put my script tag after the body is over? Now let's try to do one thing. Rather, let's try to put it inside the body. That's much better. Yeah. Since it's a sequential execution that we talked about, now what will happen is we will have HTML offered to rendering engine as I have moved this content after the body. So what was the problem earlier? Like if I have put up here script, now I have moved it like just before the body ends, somewhere here I have put up. So what difference is going to make? You will understand it that this particular script code, when it was under execution, you will find out rendering engine actually paused and it did not proceed with the body execution. Okay, is there any proof of it that it actually paused the execution? We shall see in few minutes. So the execution paused for UI rendering, and then ultimately after JavaScript execution is complete, this JavaScript execution, whichever is available at what we call it as, open directly like statements written, and we are not waiting for any events. So whatever open code which was there, which can be executed, you'll find out after that code is executed, then the rendering engine continues the execution of other so-called, you can say, tags and adds maybe certain elements into the DOM. Okay, does it make any difference putting a script here and putting a script just before the body ends? Yes, it will. Because if I move this code from here to just before body end, you will find out now rendering engine will not have to wait for the execution of script, because the script is not part of a head now. Since it's a sequential execution, you will find out this script, which is part of just before /body, you will find out a rendering engine will complete title, it will proceed with /head, it will proceed with body's rendering part, and after completion of entire body content, it's going to go and execute your var A, B, and addition kind of stuff. So ultimately, rendering engine is not going to wait rendering the UI just because JavaScript engine is executing something. Okay, anyway, rendering engine is waiting somewhere. I won't say that, because rendering engine did complete the UI interpretation or UI plotting before this 4 lines of code executed. So what we have to do now, we have to understand it as, now that I have added these lines of code here, let's see whether code executes. Let me refresh again. And now you will notice 300 is what is printed one more time, which means if I just say view source, script code is here. So when this script was a part of head, we saw the same output. And now this script is a part of body, we see the same output. Okay, output is no more different, but then it's going to go and help you plot the UI before your actual logic executes. Okay, all good. So I'll pause for a while because I would like to see some questions. So what has happened here? Okay, there were some questions and then I'll be answering those questions in a while. So, and I'll be putting the answers in the comment box. So coming back to the discussion, what happens here is I moved the script content to the body. The code did execute well, and when the code was part of head section, the code was anyway executing well. Okay, what difference does it make now? Okay, it did not putting the code inside a body or just before the body ends. It means you did not actually block the UI rendering, which is done by the rendering engine. So all UI rendering happens and then your script, so-called you can say parsing and execution begins. Okay, now is there any way that we can see that this code executes when we put it in body, and this code won't, the code inside script won't execute or maybe throws error whenever it is part of head? Let me try maybe adding some content now. So what I'm going to do is in Visual Studio Code, let me move this script one more time in head. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have input element added here. Like yesterday we used one. So input type is equal to text. And I would like to have an ID assigned to this input. Let's call it as txt, a text box name. Then we can have here some default value assigned, like maybe name like, let's say Mahesh. So what I've put up here, input element, which is obviously going to be part of DOM now. So input element is going to have type equal to text, ID equal to txt name, and value equal to Mahesh assigned. Whenever DOM gets created, this will be presented as one object. Okay. Now in the script that I have just added, I'm going to remove the script now. And now in script, just like yesterday, we tried to find the text boxes data and we tried to print it maybe in console. So just like that, I am going to ask the helper object called as document now, which is part of DOM itself. So I'm going to ask one DOM object document, that is, find me the element in the hierarchy of DOM elements. So in the DOM object hierarchy, please find me some object. It's like get object by ID. We call it as get element by ID. So get me an element by ID and I'll pass on the ID of the element. You'll find out, yesterday we discussed this, that it returns me object of HTML element kind. So here I am going to pass on the ID. And then whatever we get, I'm going to hold that object just like we tried to hold integer some time back. So I'm going to have here var maybe some element. And then now this is object, just like yesterday, in yesterday's discussion, there was an employee object, and then employee had name, employee has or address, or employee has ID and whatever. Just like that, some element is object, some element dot, there is a type, some element dot ID, some element dot value, and these values is what I would like to receive. However, I am not interested in getting type and ID. I am interested in getting the values value over here. So I'll put here some element dot value. I did not get IntelliSense there, doesn't matter. Some element dot value, and whatever value I will collect, I would like to put it in console.log, and then I'll put it like this. So what is it that I have done? I have asked in a script tag, that is JavaScript, please talk to document in a DOM and get one of the element in the DOM hierarchy which is having ID called as txt_name. So this entire thing that we have here, along with some default attributes and their values, you will find that all those things will be wrapped up in one object and offered to me. It's object of HTML element. And then I asked to that HTML element object that please get me the value of value attribute. So ideally I should get a Mahesh here. Let's see what happens now. So I am going to go to UI again and going to refresh this. Let's see what we get. Refresh. Now if you notice, on the left hand side you will find out there is a text box and there is a data Mahesh into it. And then on the right hand side what you see is we got an error which is a JavaScript error, which is going to go and tell you something like I can't find a property or attribute value of a null, which means I can't read the value of something that is null. If you look at it, it's throwing the exception at line number 6. So in the HTML page at line number 6, I received the error, okay, at line number 6, which means this line. And then what it tries to tell you is cannot read a property value, cannot read this particular property called as values data. So cannot read a property of value null. So value of a null, which means it's like null dot value you're trying to read, which means it couldn't find that element called as some element. Okay, is that it? Does that mean some element does not exist? Wait, some element actually, we try to identify using ID. So you will notice ID was there. We can see here clearly that Mahesh is written, which means element is there. Then why JavaScript can't find it? Now, to understand this, I really want a step-by-step execution. This code executed, then we got an exception, and then UI execution or UI printing happened. So there is no way to know like when exactly exception occurred and when exactly the UI printing happened. So to do that job, what I am going to do is I am going to take a control of execution, okay, which means I want line by line execution of a language code or JavaScript code. So what I'm going to do now, I am going to put here one more statement as a developer, which is called debugger. So when I put debugger here, what happens now is, since I already have opened these debugging tools, if I refresh it, please have a look. If I refresh, putting a debugger statement inside the JavaScript, it tells the development tool inside Chrome or inside any browser which supports development tools, it tells the browser, that is, provided you have pressed F12 or provided you are into something called as development tools. So when development tools are open and you already have put a debugger statement in JavaScript, it's going to go and tell the JavaScript engine that developer is running this code. Developer would like to have a full control of execution. So what is it that JavaScript engine does now? Have a look. I have refreshed the entire page. Please look at what happens. My code has paused at line number 5, which means what has happened so far, it has executed HTML, which means HTML rendering engine has done its job. Head execution started, title execution done. As you can see, demo2 is printed in the title bar on the left top, and then it has gone into script. As and when script comes up, what happens is JavaScript engine was called for. JavaScript engine took a control of execution, and then and there itself the rest of the HTML printing stopped, which means we are yet to go to this body part. We are yet to see this input element getting plotted. As you can see here on the extreme left side, you'll find out on extreme left top side there is a progress bar which is showing you that its loading is in progress. You will see there is no text box printed here somewhere, which sometime back had a value called as Mahesh. So ultimately JavaScript is under execution and rendering engine has paused the execution or plotting of UI. And now what happens is As and when I proceed with my logic, F10 is what I'm going to press now so that I can continue the execution. Or we have tools here to basically step in and step what we call it as step into the function call or step over the function call. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to go and be one step at a time is what I'm going to do. Okay, so let me take one line. So I'm in this line now. So what is it that I have asked? I have asked document object from a DOM hierarchy, which is anyway created. So I have asked the highest object document, that is, please find one element in the DOM hierarchy which has an ID called as txt name. And now keep it in mind, this is yet to execute. I am yet to have this body and input element constructed. So obviously, when you say document get me some element, it won't find that element and this should return me something. So you will find out currently if I just carry a cursor on some element is undefined. By default, if you have not initialized any member, you'll always see in JavaScript it is always initialized to undefined then. Undefined, it means so-called you can say some sort of keyword value, you can say a default value for every variable which is not assigned yet. Okay, all good. Let's see what happens now. If I say execute, now let me take a cursor on some element and observe in tooltip what appears. Now you will find out that undefined changes to something called as null. So some element is not holding anything at all because we couldn't find that element in the DOM hierarchy because it is yet to be plotted on a screen here. And then it's like null dot value is what you have asked for. So if I execute this, now we are going to end up in error. Then JavaScript execution finishes with error. The control is handed over to then rendering engine. Then it plots body, it goes and plots the input and plots Mahesh into it. Please have a look after I execute this line. You will suddenly see error in the console and you will suddenly, there will be one printed over here with a red, what we call it as highlight, which is going to tell you, say like there is an error in your code. So let me execute this. Suddenly something will happen. There will be error. There will be so-called UI plotted because the rest of the execution continues in this case. Let's see. Here we go. You'll find out there is one error that we have. You can see the error details in the console now. And then there is a UI plotted, which is like with the value Mahesh. Now this did create a problem, right? So will this code, like putting this code inside the body, will that help? So my code is dependent on something called as txt name. So I really want an assurance that this particular UI exists before I try searching for it. So when I move my script language code or script code, and if I put it just before the body finish, will it work now? Let's see. So now again what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh my web page. One more time, refresh. If I refresh, you will find out the program this is in execution, but you will notice in here right now you'll always see it's a gray window. Behind there is text box already existing and then there is Mahesh also printed, which means execution has happened. DOM is already created for HTML, head, title, body and this input element even. And now we have actually gone to script and then we ask scripting engine execute my code. Let's see what happens now. If I step in and if I carry a cursor on some element, now you will find out some element has some value. It was null some time back because now we have an assurance that this element is already created in memory and then it has got several key values available. Can I see what some element offers me? In order to see what some element offers, what you can do is you can go to either you can go and carry a cursor here. This shows you key value pairs. If you can notice, we hardly used 3 different keys: type, ID and value. But just like this type, ID and value, you will find out there are hundreds of keys and values that we can have. So most of the keys will have their default values. Some of the, you can say, popular kind of, you can say, attributes we use for, every element. So if I just carry cursor on some element, now you'll find out there is something called ID, you will find out, which we already have assigned. So there was this ID which I assigned. ID has txt name. There was this type which was text, and then there was value which was Mahesh. So ultimately it's an object has key value pairs now. DOM presentation. This is actually DOM presentation. So some element is presented in memory in this key value pair format. It's wrapped up as some DOM object. And this HTML element that I have received, this HTML element, if I just ask, please get me your value, it gives me Mahesh. So if I continue the execution, you'll find out script execution completes now, and then we are done. So there is no error, no exception, no faults at all. So putting the script tag just before the body end is going to play a vital role in this case, because you saw this code did not work when it was part of head, and this code did work when it is part of body. So does that mean we should always put the code inside body also? So what we need to understand here is, like, we need to understand something which is called as code dependencies in a way. So is your code dependent on some sort of input elements, or is your code dependent in general on the UI elements which are part of body? And then if it is that dependent, that logic is so dependent, that is, your logic is going to go and fail if you don't receive that element, or if you don't receive the element's value. Then it is suggested that such dependent code is something you should always put it inside a body. If you are part of, or if you have the logic which is part of, so-called, you can say, head, ideally in head you can always have references added, but then adding a code like this is always going to go and create a problem, because there are dependencies, and if dependencies fail, the code will fail. But do we really put a code like this anytime? Normally we wrap up the code inside functions and we keep on calling functions. Okay, nobody would like to have this some element attached to its global object like what we discussed earlier. So in general, writing, so-called, you can say, functions and then calling functions as and when you need is absolutely a good idea. Okay, now coming back to our discussion, what will happen now if at all I have this so-called the logic that I've just added? This logic, you saw it failed in head, this logic did execute in body, but sometime back when I had a code for addition, it did work in head, it did work in body as well, because that code was not dependent on any of the element as such. So dependencies are there. Please go ahead and put this inside a body, or just before the end of body happens. And then if there are no dependencies also, it's a simple logic that you can have like addition or subtraction, and like that you can always put it in head or body. It doesn't make any kind of, you can say, difference. In case of script that you have added right now, what if my script code is so-called, you can say, I want reusable? If I have added a code here just to find out if the text box has value empty or not, ultimately that code I really want it to be reusable. Suppose I have tried to find a text box, and then instead of printing this on console, I checked here if the dot value equals blank. If it is blank, I would like to show some sort of message to end user that text box is blank. It should not be blank. But then that, you can say, line of code, or those 2-3 lines of code, is it not true that I may want to use that code n number of times? I have 2-3 text boxes and I would like to use this comparison of maybe comparison for empty. I would like to have that comparison for maybe 3 different text boxes. Now what? If at all I would like to have comparison for 3 different text boxes, then ultimately I don't want to have this repetitive code added. Let me come to my point. It's like this. What if I have this entire code? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this script one more time here. Instead of we putting this code like this, I'm going to wrap it in function now. So let's say function, let's call it as validate. And in here, I'll put up element by ID, txt name. instead of printing this value, what if I check this value? So if value equals blank, if it is blank, maybe do something and show a message. Show an error message. Okay, else maybe I'll have use the data and proceed. Now, if this is done with respect to so-called text box name only, what if tomorrow I need to have one more text box here, which is for the purpose of, let's say, address. So this is text again. This is going to be something called as address. Initially, instead of having a value like Mahesh here, imagine initial values are blank. I want user to provide me those values. I'll put up here name. I'll put here address. So there is name and there is address. So this is plain text added. So with respect to plain text name, maybe I should put here enter your name, enter your address, and then there are different IDs given now. So what if I would like to proceed the check just like finding element text box name? Similar way, I'll have to literally have a replica of this code like this. I'll have to go for txt address. I'll have to go for some element 2, and then I'll have some error message, or I will start processing that address thing. Now I just have tried to copy and paste the logic, which means I repeated my logic. And normally in case of programming principles, there is one principle called as do not repeat yourself. So if you are trying to copy and paste the logic within the same program or across the modules of a program, actually we are committing a crime here. So what is it that one need to understand? If you try to copy paste the logic, you know that there is a minute difference that is going to be there. That is the reason you are trying to copy 90% of the code and 10% of modification is what you are planning to have, or maybe 0% modification or 1% modification you are planning to have. If you are looking for that much of modification, ideally you should not copy paste, and what you should do is something like you should actually make the code more generalized. Okay, here is what I mean to say. Instead of we doing a copy paste, let's look at it. What is basic difference between this 9 to 16 lines and then 18 to 25 lines? What you see is ultimately we are performing a check, which is almost same. So it can be do something and show error message. Maybe I would like to have here a console.log, and I would like to put here name cannot be empty. And then somewhere here I need to have another message which can be address cannot be empty, let's say. So ultimately now if you notice, processing can be different again. So if you see it here, this is just for the sake of validation. What differs is ID of the control, and what differs is the message which is getting printed. So instead of we hard coding it here, why can't we just expect a parameter? As we already know, here in JavaScript, in order to hold anything is an object, and ultimately we use var for holding it. So this is more local to the function now. So in JavaScript, we don't actually specify the parameter types. So we can just start using the parameter names directly. So I am expecting ID of the control, and I'm expecting, let's say, some message. Maybe I'll call it as error message. So I'm expecting ID and I'm expecting error message. And then instead of hard coding this txt name, I'll put up here ID. And instead of so-called name is not or name cannot be empty, I'll just put up error message. And then we don't have to write down these lines of code now. So a repetition is something that I have just avoided in here. So anytime I wish to call maybe validation, I'll have to keep on calling validate function, pass the ID of the control, and pass the error message that we would like to display. Please have a check now. it's like this. This is just a function declared and defined. I need to call the function. I'm yet to execute it. So what will happen if I do something like this? Validate function if I call, and if I pass on something like txt name here, and then if I pass on here something like error message, name cannot be empty. And in similar way, what will happen if I pass on here something called as txt address, and if I pass address cannot be empty. So I have created a function, reusable function, and I called the function twice. Okay, will this work? Let's see. Now if I refresh the logic again, so again what I have here is debugger. I'll just try to continue the execution directly, and one more time we are going to have a problem here, and then the first time error occurs, it goes in faulted state. Look at this, cannot read a property value of a null. It's the same error that we have received. Reason behind that, if I put the debugger inside here, refresh the code again, notice I am trying to find something which is by the id txt name, and notice in the UI I don't have the text boxes yet. So I'm trying to find a text box from a DOM or associated object in a DOM, and then without that content being there. So if I just continue here, you will find out some element is null again, which means we have same problem one more time in here. So now ultimately what is suggested here? Suggested is you can have, maybe you can have this definition here, it doesn't matter, but then calling the function is something you should do maybe here. So ultimately I should have a script tag and I should call these functions inside. So what you can say, maybe script tag which is just before the body end. What will happen if I put this entire content, if I move it and if I place it here? So in a script tag which is just before the body, if I add it, let's see if it works. Now if I continue, there won't be any error, and notice we have got enter your name, okay, and then I should see the details on a console. So maybe I should go to console now. See, console, name cannot be empty and address cannot be empty as we have put up the content. So things to understand again here is I did not place any kind of a name and address, and it has printed without error the right validation messages. Okay, as I said some time back, this function is bit reusable because I'm calling it twice, or n number of times we can call. What if some other program needs to call it? In case you are looking for this function to be called by many other HTML pages and many programs, suggestion is let's not have it as inline code to the script tag. Can't we just have just like in case of C++, you create some sort of .h files. Just like that, can't we create a reusable file out of a script code? So normally you should not end up writing code like this. Though it is reusable code, if it is reusable, let's make it more reusable by putting this code logic into another file. So I'm going to create one more file here. I'm going to paste this entire code. I'm going to save this logic, and on a desktop I'm going to create another file and name it as validation code.js. JS stands for JavaScript. So ultimately I'm just going to create one .js file which is going to have a validation logic inside. So let me say save this. Now that JS code is there, so actual logic, reusable logic is here, and who is using it now? A script tag inside HTML page is going to use it now. So this is my script tag which is calling this validate function twice. Will my code work now? How will this HTML or rendering engine will get to know from where to refer validate? Because I have not defined validate anywhere in this HTML context or script context. So generally what you should mention is you should refer this .js file. Okay, how do I refer a .js file which is externally written? So ideally you can have here a script tag added. You can specify source and you can close it, and you can specify I have a interest of calling validation code.js. So ultimately what will happen now, what will happen if I put script tag like this? So there are two script tags now, one for calling downloading validation code.js, and then 2 lines of code in another script tag for calling validate function. Will this code work? Let's see. I have an interest of maybe like in the UI, what you saw is it's all aligned one after another, like all the contents are one after another. Enter your name, then enter your address and the text box. Just to align it properly, I need to have one line in between these two placeholders. So I'll put here BR, it means break tag, and then I'm just going to go and add one line break here. So now I have it, move to the next line. So now let me try hitting the code one more time. So F12, I'm going to go and do refresh here. Keep it in mind, validation code.js, this is already downloaded now. So validation code.js is a part. Can I see validation code.js is actually getting downloaded? Okay, here we go. I will go to network window, just like we saw console, we saw sources. I'm going to go to network window now. You will find out what has happened is I had given call to demo2.html file, this file, and then this file when gets downloaded, please have a look. When this demo2.html file, which I have called for, gets downloaded, what is it that happens? We talked about it. HTML tag, head tag, title tag. You will find out the rendering engine is looking at your code one after another. So as and when the HTML engine or rendering engine looks at HTML, creates an associated DOM object, head creates an associated DOM object. When it reaches to the script, you will find out now rendering engine realizes this, that it's not the cup of tea that is for the rendering engine. So it hands over this particular execution part to, let's say, the scripting engine, and then JavaScript engine realizes that is there is no direct code available, rather I should ask browser to download something called as validation code.js, and then there will be call given immediately to validation code.js. So there is another call given to validation code.js file. Okay, all good. But then now this validation code.js is getting downloaded. Imagine a scene, this validation code.js file is huge. If it is huge, ultimately completion of download is going to take time. And then what will happen? If at all completion of download is taking time, you will notice the rest of the code execution is going to go on be paused now till the time download completes over here. Okay, understood. Then if at all, let's say validation code.js is downloaded, ultimately we need the reusable code. So we have the reusable code, let's say, downloaded. Now the next script tag that you have here, this particular script tag starts execution, because after this is downloaded, now this script will continue. Now validate function will be called. This validation.js will be searched for validate function. Validate function it finds. It tries to find out the DOM element called as so and so, and then it won't find it because this is yet to be plotted. One more time, exactly same problem. So whether it is single text box or multiple text boxes, whether it is reusable code or whether it is so-called code sticky to your text boxes or elements, you will always find out whenever your code is bit dependent on your elements, ensure that your elements exist in the UI first. And that's the reason what is expected to be done in this code is we should put this code here. So ultimately downloading the script content is something that we should do maybe in like just before the body completion, and then we will have even the script content or maybe called or executed. I did say it earlier as well, that is, if your code is not dependent on UI elements, then it's better you put your logic in a head. But then if your code is bit dependent on something called as UI elements, it's always better to go for assurance that UI elements exist before you find those elements. Okay, is there any other approach inside if I put it in head and it executes? There are. We will see those approaches as well as and when we reach to the concept called as events. since we haven't seen events yet, it's a good practice to put it inside a body. So as of now, script src is put up, script is there, and script is going to get called. Okay, let's see what happens now. If I refresh this code one more time, refresh it, we already have these two files downloaded now. Then we are already in a console, already in sources. We have a debugger here. Continue this, we'll find out in console we have both the messages put up. There is no error, no exception at all. Code executes in a very smooth manner. So again, going back to code. So this script, when we put up here, this is just assurance that UI is already ready, and then I have, what we call it as the code assurance now. Code dependent on elements is going to get executed. All good, all good. Now what will happen if at all, even if it's my logic, like let's say there was addition code, if you recall. So what will happen if I put here script src and some addition code .js if I call for, and let's say I don't have anything like this in picture at all. Now this some addition code, which was like not dependent on the text boxes, will this cause any problem now? It won't cause a problem in terms of execution, but then there will be problem in terms of downloading it. If the download is going to take time, ultimately your UI rendering is basically paused because JavaScript is yet to finish the downloading of scripting. And maybe if there is some sort of, you can say, global context code, it will have to execute that global context code as well. If it's a function, you will have to call the function. But then if there is like directly code written inside a .js file, that particular code execution will also take time. So what is suggested then? Normally, just say maybe one more concern. What will happen? Let me comment this code. I just have commented using Ctrl+KC as a shortcut here. And for uncomment, you can use Ctrl+KU as another shortcut. So what will happen if I have multiple number of .js files? So there is like code 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, or 5 files, let's say. So what will happen if there are like 5 different files that we have to download? It's all sequential, as you know. So there will be partially DOM construction which will happen along with document window like objects, which are like typical global objects. So along with those objects, you will find out some UI elements will go as a part of DOM. Scripting engine will shoot a call for this .js file. Then once download is done, once some global context is constructed, it will give a call to second, then third, then fourth, and then fifth. Okay. Now normally, can't it just go and give a call to like multiple number of files at a time? You will find out by default, there are some barriers that we have. Generally, there are various what we call it as HTTP protocol versions that we have. So we have HTTP 1.0, we have HTTP 1.1, and we have HTTP 2.0. So ultimately, with so-called, you can say HTTP 1 and 1.1, we'll find out there are like typical limitations of like, couple of files can be downloaded at a time. So once those are over, or simultaneously, once those are over, you can call the next two, then you can call the next two, and so on. And then generally in case of HTTP 2.0 as in protocol, you will find out it's like frame by frame, like one single request you can put up, and then you will find out a multiple number of so-called, you can say, responses can be received. It's something which is called as framing technique in case of prototype. So in case you are looking for any more details about how HTTP 1.1 and 2.0 behaves, one can very well go and maybe understand it through Worldwide Consortium's website. So if you search for W3C and HTTP 1.0, 1.1 and 2.0, like protocol differences, you will find out how exactly the things are going to work. So currently, like in the latest browsers with HTTP 2.0, it may not matter like how many times I put up here script tag. But then in the browsers which are supporting something called as HTTP 1.1 or so, or the servers which are basically understanding HTTP 1, you will find out those so-called, you can say, supporting clients and servers will have some problems, like if there are like couple of calls to be served at a time, then rest of the calls are ultimately blocked, which means in this case even the calls for getting images will also be blocked. Now there is a concern that we have. However, Chrome and other browsers may have an escape to this, which is in terms of something which we will see later on, in terms of so-called maybe creating some sort of instances of what we call it as execution in memory. So anyway, that's not a concern. We will see that part in threading, which is the last session specifically for JavaScript. But as of now, let's say putting the script tags like this is not going to help me in HTTP 1.1. So then what is it that is suggested? It is always suggested that if there are multiple files which you are supposed to download, always put it in a hierarchy, like dependency. So if 5 is dependent on 4, then put 4 first. If 4 is dependent on 3, put 3 first. And then you can always have maybe files put up one after another. So see the dependencies on of .js files on each other, accordingly arrange the hierarchy, and then suggestion, instead of putting all these files as a part of, you can say, head tag, because this download is going to block the execution of body in this case. Suggestion is you can put the script tags as a part of so-called body. So it can be like before /body, you can always put up the script tags now. Okay, what next? The next thing is, can I have, like, instead of I giving 4-5 different requests over here, if all the files are going to come from the same server, why can't we have a technique here? It's something like, why can't we just have maybe 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 and plus 5? Why can't we just have one single file which actually consists of all the JavaScript content also? Can we actually go and put up maybe entire, like all JavaScript contents in one single file? So instead of putting here underscore, I should say like plus this plus this. This is not a syntax. Keep it in mind. This is for the purpose of understanding. So instead of we referring 4 different .js files, what if I have got one big file created which has references to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or which has got all code clubbed into one single file? It will be a giant file. Yeah, I understand that. But then if I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as in .js file, is it not true that instead of giving 5 requests and waiting for 5 different outputs from a server side, we are just going to wait for one single output only from a server? Will that be faster? To some extent, yes, it will be a bit faster. But then what will happen if one .js file had a code for empty validation? 2.js file has a code which is for some regular expression or some sort of a weird validation. And in my application, I am actually looking for empty validations only. I am not looking for maybe that weird validation. But just because some module requires it, I have referred to .js file. You will actually find out that combining all these files will increase the download size. But at the same time, it will cause another issue. That is, even if I don't need some sort of .js file right now, maybe I have a plan to basically download that file later on programmatically, you will find out it can be part of some sort of big .js file. Ultimately, splitting your .js files into multiple different parts, or your .js code or JavaScript code into multiple different .js files, is always going to help, because that way you can always refer what you need. But then, is there any mechanism that is, instead of copying and pasting all the JavaScript code into one giant file, specifically to after understanding the HTTP 1 and 1.1, so specifically for avoiding multiple calls, is it that I myself will have to add those files or add that JavaScript code into one single file? No. Normally, you don't have to do all of it. You still will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 .js files created, and then normally on server side you can always use something which is called as bundling APIs, and then those bundling APIs will actually, during deployment, these bundling APIs can actually go and construct something which is called as one .js file out of it. So ultimately what will happen here is 1.js, 2.js, you will keep on creating these files only, and then these files can be given, like all these files, 1.js, 2.js, 3.js, can be given to something which is called as bundling APIs. So these bundling APIs are available in .NET, Java, and then there are like open source APIs as well. And then bundling APIs can very well go and give us some .js file, which can be having some sort of maybe a weird name or some sort of name which is auto-generated. Something like, let's say, maybe some code like this. So this maybe whatever, something.js file is going to get constructed, and this particular file is actually going to have this file. Maybe I should put it like this. This file will have code from 1.js, 2.js, and 3.js. So ultimately, we don't have to go and maybe club these .js files by ourselves, because there can be chaos. There can be something called as there can be some dependencies, or I should say, there can be something called as some same variable names, same function names, and so on. So bundling APIs can take care of all that. Okay, so I may have multiple files clubbed into single file. So instead of I asking for 123.js, simply in my code, I will ask for this .js file. So instead of asking for 1.js, 2.js, I will simply ask for this particular file. Okay, then is it not true that this particular file will be big in size? This file will be big in size because these are small files. Okay, doesn't matter. 3 different calls versus 1 single call. Can I even go and reduce the size of this .js file? So here is what we need to understand now. Can we reduce the size of the .js file? Here we go. I am going back to our scripting or validation code. So hopefully you understand the typical bundling APIs. This is not part of this entire discussion, so I'm going to skip that part. So I'll just remove this content. So I have removed the comment now. So there is a source code, there is a source file .js file called, and there is a validate call. Okay, all good. Let's see whether it is working still. I have to call this file. I'll continue the execution here. Continue the execution here. On console, what you can see is these things are getting printed. And as I said earlier, right now we are calling validation code.js. Had it been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I would have seen 5 different calls. And instead of 4 different calls, using bundling, we can actually club multiple .js files into single file. And then a single .js file can be downloaded in a single request itself that way. But then size will be on a higher side. So can we reduce the size of this .js file? Normally, if I consider one character equal to 1 byte, you will find out instead of we making this content, I'm just going to create new file now. Let's save it here. I'm yet to save it as .js. So instead of if I consider one character equal to 1 byte in this case, you will see how much I have downloaded just now is something like some size here. So content download was, okay, let me see. Size was somewhere like 253 bytes over here. So if this download involved 253 bytes over the network, can I reduce this in the first place? Okay. Where we can reduce it? Very first thing, if you are using production environment, normally in a production environment, you should you should understand it like debugger was put up for developers need. So whenever you put your code on the production server, ensure that you have removed or at least commented the debugger's lines all over. Then the next thing to understand, if there are any comments also, these comments for development purpose, developers understanding purpose and maintenance purpose. Okay, then you should remove those comments from the actual .js file. Okay, is it not true that it's going to go and make the file which is readable, not readable, or something like maintenance wise difficult? We'll see. So now if we notice, some element is one variable. As I said, one character equal to 1 byte. So when I had to download this file, obviously the file had this variable name, some element. And if I say some element over here, these 4 characters versus this so-called 7 characters here, 7 plus 4, there are like 11 characters all in all that we have here. So 11 bytes is what I have allocated specifically for one variable name. So instead of making this some element of size 11 bytes, can't I just go and reduce this to some variable like this? So instead of we calling it as some element, Now we will call it as a dot value. Instead of calling this as id, what if I call it as I? What if I call it as e? And what if I call it as I here? What if I put up e over here? What if I remove these spaces that we have right now here, like this? If there are any comments that we have, we can very well go and remove those comments. Just imagine this code is definitely not readable at all. And it becomes very difficult in terms of maintenance now, whenever something like this comes up. So this code that we have written, it's kind of, you can say, not easily maintainable and not easily readable code, because I have removed spaces, I have made it kind of, you can say, difficult to maintain kind of a file. Okay. Now this file is definitely size-wise less compared to what was there in validationcode.js. And this particular file, I have a plan to store it as validationcode.mean.js. So it's a minified version of a .js file that we have now. Now, this particular file, this is more of a production file and this is more of a development mode file. So validationcode.js is something you will write during development. You will maintain two versions of this file or code. You will maintain one version which is development version with a proper name set, with the proper comments and everything else. And you will have the other version maintained which is called as validationcode.mean.js. But then this is very tricky. For a while, it was like, hardly couple of lines of code I had to actually write down. So for couple of lines of code, it was good. Let me complete this. For couple of lines of code, it was easy for me to check the variable names and change the variable names or put the spaces and everything. Normally, you will find out validationcode.mean.js. This I created, but there are tools available and which are called as minification tools. So just like what we discussed here, there are bundling APIs. You will also find out we also have something which is called as minification APIs. And then instead of you doing it hard-coded, validationcode.mean.js, what you have is now a minified version you will get through APIs. You don't have to actually go and construct these things by yourself. So this was just for the sake of understanding, so I did it. But normally there are APIs available for minification. So what is it that is expected then? I won't get this 337775 so and so. I'll rather get .mean coding convention wise .js. So ultimately, multiple number of files call can be reduced by single file call using bundling APIs. And then instead of we downloading a huge file on the client side, minifying that code can be done by minification APIs. And then we'll have .mean.js. So .NET has got like server-side .NET has got minification APIs which are like server-side technology. Bundling APIs are already inbuilt. Minification APIs, there are third-party APIs like something which is there's a tool called as JSub. There are like some minification tools that you can just Google about, and you'll find out those tools will help you do the minification by yourself. And in case you are looking for server-side Java and .NET, it will have the minification and bundling APIs or libraries which can help you on the go. So instead of I referring in my application, now validationcode.js, I will start referring in my code something like script src, and I'll have validationcode.mean.js referred. And now if I run this code, this was like 253 bytes. Refresh it. Now I have just reduced it to 99 bytes. So if I go back to console, it's the same thing that you will notice. So from 253 bytes, I managed to reduce it to 99 bytes, and which is ultimately a faster download. Less bandwidth will be utilized. Even if somebody has to simply open the code, somebody will be able to see code like this. JavaScript code is always, has a concern for many. That is this, since this code executes inside a browser, people always worry about like, what if somebody steals my logic? What if somebody sees my logic? So instead of giving them the logic in a boilerplate, ready-made plate, instead of that, what we can have is, we can have minified version of a .js given. So that way your code will be not easy to read. Your code will be difficult to read and difficult to understand even. So What we try to understand in case of current discussion is we try to understand where exactly script should be added. So adding a script in a head versus adding a script in a body, then adding a direct code versus putting a code in .js file, then understanding the dependencies in .js and the HTML elements, then instead of downloading multiple number of files, can we club into one single file, and then instead of downloading a huge file, can we minify the amount of .js or you can say JavaScript code inside it. So we try to understand bundling and we try to understand something called as minification as well. So we haven't gone to slides yet. So I'm just going to quickly run through the slides just to quickly understand what's remaining. So we try to understand some basics here. Then we try to understand how do we associate JavaScript with HTML. Some ways available. So putting it in head, putting it in body, and then pros and cons of it. Requesting multiple .js files. So instead of that, currently it's not a concern, because if you start using HTTP 2.0, you'll find out in one single call you can actually get multiple number of files, which is called as typical framing concept in case of HTTP 2.0. Then download size, if it's high, you can always go for minification APIs, is what we try to understand. Now, then next thing, like while we author JavaScript, we try to understand here something like dependencies on a UI. So we have to understand this very thoroughly, that if your code is dependent on UI elements, ensure that UI is already created, and then so that your JavaScript code can execute. So let's not search for the element before it gets even plotted. That's the reason best is your dependent code should be put up in a body instead of putting it in a head. Otherwise, it can be something called as event-based execution, which we will see sometime tomorrow in a DOM manipulation. So there's one more approach that we will see sometime tomorrow. And then there is, we try to understand putting script directly and putting script inside external file. Now, JavaScript hoisting is another concept that we need to understand now. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. It's a very interesting concept that we have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to another .html file, and in that .html file I'll be adding some code now. So a new file I'll create. Let's save this as demo03.html. okay, and this demo3.html file that we have, here I'll have some basics added first. So HTML head, just a quick decoration, demo3, I'll have a script here, I'll have body here. Okay, all done. And now let's switch to script code one more time. So what we need to understand now, that hoisting. Now, this is something which is another interesting topic in case of JavaScript. So let's do one thing. Let's try to put up here one variable first, just like that, in a global context. So there is, we discussed at the start of this session that there is something called as window object, which is already created, and then whatever you add directly inside a script, you'll find out whether it is a function or whether it is something called as a variable. It is always added as a key value pair in the what we call it as in window object, and we saw it in the console window as well. So let me do one thing. Let me put here where message is equal to hello all or hello JS, and then I'll have a function here. Let's call it as say something, and then I'll have on a console logged something. Okay, now, and this particular variable content is what I need to print. So I have a variable declared and defined, I have a function declared and defined, and now I wish to call this thing. So I'm going to put now console.log, and I'm going to put now message, and I'm also going to call say something here. So what do you think? What will be called? What you'll see is hello.js will be printed, and then what you see is, since say something gets called after that, something will be printed on the console. Let's see whether it works. So going back to the code content now, 03 is what we will call. Sorry, it should be 03. Here we go. And let's see on a console what is printed. As we know, the code gets executed, so it says hello.js and it says something. So hello.js and then something over here. Okay, all seems good as of now. So it's like the way we have written, it gets executed. So this declaration, definition, and then we just called the variable and we called the function. Now to understand hoisting, let's do one thing. Let's take this code and put it here. Will this code work now? So what I did is I tried to put variable after, and then I have already used the variable value maybe somewhere in console.log. So what do you think what will happen now? So let's try to understand it. Let's refresh it here and see what happens now, shall we? Now you will find out what happens is there is undefined put up on a screen, and then there is something which is printed. Now why this? Message, it actually did not show me any error. You know this, that when the error is shown, it is always shown in red color in Chrome, and then there is always this so-called error icon with the number of errors appears somewhere on the right top. So this is not error, it's actually trying to print a value of that message which is set to undefined. And since something is printed, so function is getting called. But had it been C or C++, you will find out we would have actually faced errors, lots of errors in this case. Okay. Now, if I say lots of errors, why? Because in typical programs like C or CPP, what we expect is we expect the declared definition first, and then we expect a usage. Here, it looks like I have done the usage and then I have maybe declared and defined it. Now, here is what happens. Generally, if you Google about this concept called as hoisting, what people tell you, what is conveyed normally in articles and so on, that is by default JavaScript engine, whenever it looks at script, it actually tries to take all this content up. So it's not physically going to go and take anything up. So to understand this, some people will also, like, why I'm telling you this is because this is something which I also have seen. You can say blog tells you what hoisting is, but it is always wrongly conveyed. Something like this, like this content will always be taken up here. Like when people tell you hoisting, they tell you like this is taken, declaration of variables, then functions, declarations and definitions are taken up, and then the rest of the code for calling is put up. It's not like that. So ideally, why did I see undefined over here? So ideally what has happened is var, let's say message, this is what it looks like, and then there is later on something called as message printed. So what will happen if I give a call to console.log and if I put a message over here? Please have a look. Before I proceed with this code, let me remove this. So it's exactly the same thing. So I call console.log, I call for message. I did not get here hello.js, what I got is undefined. Then say something was called, then something gets printed. Then this console.log message again gets called. This time message is already defined with hello.js. Let me refresh this. What you see is now first time it is undefined and second time it is hello.js, which means sequential execution. Okay. Why was first time it was like undefined? It should have thrown me exception like this does not exist. So ideally, the code that people can tell you is something like this. People will tell you this is always done in this way. Var message is equal to undefined, and then there is something like message equal to hello.js later on assigned. And then if you run this, it's the same output you will notice. same undefined and same hello.js. Okay, but then is it that JavaScript engine is going to go and do all this moving thing, like moving the function up, then declaring your variables to undefined and so on? So here is what happens. There is no physical, so-called you can say, movement of the variable declarations and definitions or function definitions is going to go and happen. So what is it that happens behind the scene is, during the parsing stage of your JavaScript, ultimately JavaScript is supposed to be given any code for that matter, any code which is under execution, which has to be executed by your CPU. CPU typically understands something like zeros and ones. So ultimately your code that you have written, it needs to be converted into something called as zeros and ones, translated into something that your CPU understands. So somebody has to do that job. So in case of JavaScript, JavaScript engine is responsible for doing that. Okay, JavaScript engine is the one who is responsible for maybe allocating memory or deallocating memory, specifically for the purpose of these variables and functions. So what is it that JavaScript engine does initially? It actually tries to go through your entire code. Let's call it as parsing. And when it actually tries to go through your code, go through doesn't mean execution. It goes through your code and tries to identify there are variables and there are functions that we have. So whenever it goes through your entire code, what it does is it actually tries to put up now. I'm going to here now. So when JavaScript engine goes through your JavaScript code written, what it does, it observes what are the variables that we have. So without even understanding, like, there is a var message set up to something called as hello.js. What it does is these things that you have asked for. So did you ask for message and is it declared? What it is defined to, it doesn't matter to it, because there can be cases like if so and so happens, assign a message equal to ABC. If that thing happens, assign a value to message equal to PQR. So it won't actually look at the what we call it as the right hand side, like what values are assigned to those members. It's just going to go and quickly check. There is a message variable that you have declared. What you defined it to, it doesn't matter. And then it will actually assign that message variable a value initially that is undefined. Undefined means it's a what we call it as a keyword value which is assigned to message. It's not defined yet. It's yet to have a value. Even say something that you have. Say something is actually that you have defined. Let's say it's undefined. So ultimately your function that you have, your message variable that you have, let's say initially these are undefined, and then as and when it goes and checks, when you say console.log, you asked for, sorry, this is like function by default will not have undefined, because function is always assigned in this way. Function is always declared like this, not undefined. It will always be something like it's a function with the body content as it is. So this is like, the content itself, function as is assigned. So normally what happens is, after looking at your variable values or variables, what is it that JavaScript does is it assigns your variable undefined value. Your functions will carry the body of the function as is. Now what happens is, whenever execution phase starts, console.log, there is a message value that it expects. I did not assign a message value undefined. Rather, it was already there. But why undefined was there? Because I had it declared in this case. So it prints undefined here. Say something function already has a body, so it executes and prints something. Then so-called you can say this is as good as I said earlier, it was like this, defined automatically. This is automatically defined, and later on the value that you assigned hello.js will be assigned to it. So this variable declaration will be to undefined. All variable declarations will be to undefined initially, and then based on your logic during execution, those variables will be assigned with respective values. So what I have here, this prints undefined. Now we have value assigned, and here it prints the actual value. So again, if I run this, I'm going to get undefined something and hello.js. Coming back to again discussion over here. Maybe I should have saved it first. It's the same thing again, not much of a change. Now, what will happen if I don't declare this variable by myself? So if you have not declared it by yourself, like var message, anywhere in the logic, you are going to go and get an error now. So message is not defined. So whether you had hello.js assigned to it or not, it really doesn't matter. Did you put var message? Did you declare this as a variable in your logic anywhere? So you'll find out anywhere at a global scope. So did you declare that variable? If not, then you have no right to use that variable. And then it will not hold any undefined value, because during parsing it did not find var message nowhere, and then it shows you error, message is not defined. So even message, like if you have var message defined, initially it was undefined only. So during parsing phase, JavaScript engine will find out, is there any var declared? Yes, message. Let's assign it to undefined. Is there anything else declared? Yes, let's define it as undefined. And then during the execution phase, sequential execution phase, as and when the time comes, it says, okay, I'm looking for message. What message holds? Undefined. It prints undefined here. Now what message holds? Hello.js. So it assigns hello.js to that, so-called you can say message, and then it continues. So you will find out here, normally what is conveyed to people in case of hoisting is not physically, but then logically JavaScript engine will move all these function declarations and definitions up, and then it will start using it. It's not like that. JavaScript engine is not going to go and do any of it. What JavaScript engine does is, it goes through your code, reads your code, all the variables that you have declared, it assigns it to undefined, and then during execution phase, as and when the logic comes up, it will start assigning or fetching the values out of those variables. So you'll always notice it's not true that all the variables and functions are taken up in the hierarchy and then the execution happens. So it is wrongly conveyed as hoisting by many people. So you have to understand it. There is always something called as creation phase. We call it as parsing phase. Variables are created and assigned with undefined value. And then there is something which is called as execution phase, wherein you will find out these variables will be like assigned or fetch the values from. And undefined in here is a very key resource. Like undefined value actually has a meaning. Again, some to do thing here, never ever try to define maybe something like undefined by yourself, because undefined means it's not assigned yet. So it's always better, you should not set the value to undefined by yourself. You can set up any value for for the logic purpose. Otherwise you will never know this undefined was set up by the JavaScript engine itself, or whether the value is set up by so-called by the developer. So let's not have this habit of putting undefined for some variable by ourselves. It's always good that you can always have some sort of what we call it as some default or some sort of maybe opcode value assigned to your variables whenever the logic requirement comes up. So that leaves us with JavaScript hoisting concept, and we already have talked about a debugger. So we try to understand breakpoint window, rather putting a breakpoint. Breakpoint should be removed during the production environment. We talked about console window, and then working with styles and CSS panel. Now this particular portion that we have, let's go back to UI again. So I'm going to go to this demo 2. So there is an input that we have. What I'll do is, just like there is a, if you recall this validation code, I have input has a type text, ID and a value. Just like that, it can also have something called a style. Now normally from the appearance perspective, we are anyway going to want to dig into it sometime after in the differentiation, but still, what if I have a background color here set up? So normally appearance specific values as a key value pair can be specified to the style itself. So style as a key will have a value which itself is a complex value. These are like simple values. Type has text, ID is txt name, value is blank, but style itself is a complex element. So style will have a value which is, the value itself is key value pair. So background color, I'll put it as, let's say, yellow. Now let's go back to UI. I'm going to demo 2. This is yellow color that we have. Now, normally, when the UI settings are done by developer, so let's say there is a change which is required. Maybe you are yet to decide and you are actually doing a research here, like what sort of color will be looking good with respect to this text box. So normally what people do is people may go to the source code and people may try doing a changes here. So it's not yellow, it can be, let's say, aqua. And then they'll refresh this code and look at it. Normally doing a change specifically for styling or CSS and then going back to the UI and seeing it, this takes time. So instead of that, what's the easiest option available is, you can very well right click here, you can go to inspect. It simply opens up elements window only, and then you will notice that we have options available here. So currently the element has got background color, which is called as, let's say, aqua. What you can do is you can very well change it here itself. So I need a red, and then simultaneously you will find out the color change happens on the left hand side. So you are free to do the changes and you can see the changes, over here itself. We will look at this window and these other things over here in altogether different session. So I'm not going to go into styling, but then this was just to help you understand elements window, console window. Then we talked about a source code that we have, and then we also saw network window when we saw something called as download size reduction, and then how the typical calls actually go and reply comes up. So this is something that we have talked about now. So it's a quick revision that we will have. So what we discussed in this today's session is how do we associate a JavaScript code with HTML. So we saw the approach. You can put the code directly inside a head tag or inside script tag, and script can be inside head or script can be inside a body. However, putting a code directly is not a good solution. You can always have a code wrapped up in functions and you can have a function call. Then if your code has dependencies, then you should always resolve those dependencies by allowing HTML interpretation first, HTML rendering first, and then the logic execution. Then you can always make code more reusable by putting the code inside .js file, and you can always have multiple JS files constructed. And then instead of like multiple JS files downloading on the client side, you can always use bundling API to club everything into single file. You can use minification API to ultimately go and minify the amount of download. Then there is another thing that we talked about is execution flow. So it's like typical sequential execution, and then what matters is how you assign JavaScript code into your HTML. Then we talked about quick hoisting thing. So it's like how typical memory allocation happens or variables are assigned to, and then what mistakes a developer can make, like by defining a variable to undefined or so. So we just try to clear that a thing. The confusion between like hoisting, which is normally covered in blogs, versus what actually happens behind the scene. Then we talked about browser development tools. So we checked about debugging, and then we used it since the first demonstration today. And then we talked about styles and CSS check. So there's more to it in upcoming sessions. So this leaves me with questions and answers. So what I'm going to do now for next a few minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer the questions that are piled up in the comments section. So I'll be answering the questions. Like I have answered some of the questions in the in this course itself or during the session itself. Some of the questions which are like pending, I'll answer those questions now. Answers can be checked in the comments window. Some URLs also I'm going to go and give here. I am not using camera today. The reason is there was a sync up issue yesterday. So we are like almost done here. So in case you have any like questions, you can very well send those questions offline too. Mahesh@bonaventuresystems.com. That's my email ID. And then expect answer in a short while. After the end of this live session, what I'll be doing is I will be collecting this recording, and I'll be providing it over the YouTube channel. So in case you missed or you started maybe a little late today, what you can do is you can always check back later. So this is where we end today's session. So we have covered 2 sessions, one on HTML DOM, one on basics and debugging. So tomorrow we will have a session planned which is working with DOM. So that's where we end today's session. See you tomorrow. Thank you.